Thank you for taking part in the Taper Time webinar. We're going to discuss how to train, recover, and perform better. This will go through a variety of topics. The one topic that we're not going to spend an exorbitant amount of time on is hydration and nutrition, just because that should be its own webinar and it will be its own webinar in the future. So look forward to that. So let's just start out with kind of how we're going to approach the information today. So malarkey, meaningless talk, nonsense. It's a good word, used every once in a while. So there was a recent article from Runner's World where they talked about the 8 or 9 or 10 worst things that you could do to halt your recovery post-run. And one of those things was to not get out of your sweaty clothes as fast as possible. So basically they were saying that cold clothes was bad. But later in the same magazine where they were talking about how to improve recovery, they talked about ice baths and cryotherapy was good. So what we have to determine is that Runner's World is dumb. So that's our A plus B equals C equation. Now, why do I bring this up, and I am picking on Runner's World a little bit, is that I have this picture of this colander or strainer over on the left, is we have to learn how to strain and filter and distill information a little bit better because there is so much information out there. So I hope that today's webinar can do just that for you, and I also hope that you use me and any references I put out there in the future for the same reasons. So this is targeted towards runners, but this goes for any athlete. But the issues we face as athletes when it comes to recovery are things like injury, pain, fatigue, motivation, and mental preparedness. Now there are plenty of other ones, and most of those other ones are going to deal with time. But these are the big ones that I've come to discuss in this webinar, and we'll break each one of these down. So when we're talking about how to properly recover to stay away from things like pain and injury and motivation loss, we need to go through this list, and on the top of this list is sleep. Sleep is huge. Then would come injury and pain management, so how we go about getting ourselves back from these scenarios, because they will happen inevitably. Varied movement, breathing, and nutrition hydration. So through each one of these main topics, hopefully we hit every aspect of recovery, or at least some form of So sleep, the mother of recovery. Why is it the mother of recovery? Well, there's multiple different types of recovery that take place while we sleep, one being neuromuscular recovery. So when we sleep, our brain and the rest of our nerves and free nerve endings will have myelin repaired or laid down based on the patterns that, or the thoughts, or the things that we did that day, the connections that we performed. So let's say we're a runner and we're running every day, those connections are getting stronger. Let's say we're cross training. Now we're going to maybe not prune some of the running connections, but we're going to offset them so our body doesn't get into these habitual patterns, which is actually what we want as a runner since we do so much of the same activity. Waste elimination. So when we sleep, our body goes to work through the lymphatic system and the microglial system to eliminate waste, and that's both musculoskeletal and brain waste. So kind of cool studies coming out about the glial system in the brain and how it eliminates waste through the CSF, and just a cool little tidbit there. Studies have found if you lay on the left side of your body that you remove more waste via that microglial system. Cognition is improved. This makes sense. Sleep deprivation causes a lack in mental clarity, so when we sleep we get improved cognition, which is going to improve our performance both physically and mentally the next day. Healing. I tell all of my patients you don't stand a chance at healing if you're not sleeping properly, so that's why it's at the top of my list, because I'm usually dealing with pain and injury. So it's a big deal, but what we see most of the time with runners and other athletes is this kind of a mantra. Is this run now, sleep later, right? Well, Or, even if we extrapolate that into the working world or whatever it is that we're willing to trade sleep to get more of the activity of choice, thinking that that's the better trade. But as you can see, if we focus in on this person did not get enough sleep, forgot to tie their shoe, so who knows what's going to happen to them. But they're probably going to take a little spill here, and they're not going to be happy for it. Now they're going to be injured, they're going to be in pain, they got to recover. But basically, sleep is very, very important. So let's figure out how do we make sure that we're getting enough sleep. So here's kind of my sleep guidelines. 6 to 8 hours of restful sleep. So just because I'm laying in bed for 6 to 8 hours does not mean that that's restful sleep. No exercise 2 hours before bed. We're going to, if we exercise within that time frame, we raise body temperature, we raise blood pressure, we stimulate the brain. Those are all the things that we want to do the opposite of, right? We want to cool down our environment. We want to decrease our blood pressure. We want to decrease stimulation to our brain so we get, again, restful sleep. So how do we do that? Through things like stretching, foam rolling before bed. That's a really good way to just calm the system down, get your body to switch from that sympathetic or that fight or flight into that parasympathetic state. Get on a schedule. So try to maintain the same bedtime and wake up time. Our body and our brains respond very, very well to consistency. And sleep is one of the biggest things that we need to make sure that we're trying to keep consistent. And in that schedule, we need to make sure that we're avoiding electronics before bed. So I'm sure many of you know that the blue light that is emitted from your devices like phones, iPads, computers is again stimulating to the brain. So it's going to stimulate more alpha wave activity in the brain. And that's not what we want before we want to go to sleep. We want to get into the delta wave pattern, which is what we're going to in restful sleep. It changes a little bit in REM sleep. But there are apps like the Lux, L-U-X, Lux app for your computer. There's one that's automatically installed on iPhones that helps eliminate blue light. And then first thing upon waking, it is a really good idea to get natural light. So our body, and the pineal gland in particular, responds to natural light to help set what's called the diurnal clock, which is basically your body's kind of natural ebbs and flows through day and light. And this is very important because we live in a world now where we could spend a lot of our time indoors with artificial lights, so our body can get thrown off of its natural or normal diurnal clock. Eliminate as much light as possible while you're sleeping. So this is dependent on where your house or your apartment or where you're living, street lights and setting. We need to get things set up like darkening shades and curtains. Make sure we don't have phones and computers and other lights on in the house. So it's a big deal because those little things can again create little stimulation to the brain that keep us on a kind of constant sleep-wake cycle. So this one is maybe up for debate a little bit, but no caffeine after noon. 3 if you're a fast metabolizer. So an easy way to know if you're a fast versus slow metabolizer caffeine. If you're a slow metabolizer, you're probably going to be more of the type of person that gets a little jittery, shaky. Caffeine affects you more. Slow metabolizer, you could be like my wife. She can drink a cup of coffee and go to bed. So noon is a good, just safe call if you're a slow metabolizer. 3 if not, because even if you can fall asleep, you may not be getting restful sleep. No alcohol 3 hours before bed. Now this is one where some people say, well, I have a glass of wine or a drink after dinner or at night to help me actually go to sleep. Well, it may help you fall asleep, but the alcohol itself is actually not giving you restful sleep, and you go through more waking cycles when you drink alcohol, especially if you drink a lot of alcohol and we pass out. That is not restful sleep. So no alcohol 3 hours before bed. And we want to try to get our sleep environment around 68 degrees. And some of you may think that's a little cool, but our body is best regulated for sleep around that temperature. Now, we get into the last little topic of sleep. Should I run in the morning or should I sleep in? And you can see I've got a little arrow that says depends. Well, it depends because it is important to get out there and do our our sport of choice and run and things like that. But if we've sacrificed, maybe we've had to do certain things for work, or we've been traveling and we know that we're not getting the sleep like we should, or we're dealing with an injury, or we've been a little under the weather, then we may sacrifice that early morning run to get just a little more sleep. So it depends. So let's kind of talk about pain. And this is what I usually see in the clinic is some sort of mindset like this, right? And we're all familiar with that. So I'm going to nerd out on you for a second. So pain neuroscience in a nutshell. So nociception. Nociception is basically the feedback that your body is giving your brain to alert it to pain. So pain is a perception, okay? And I say sometimes because you can have nociception without pain. Now pathology, injury, should equal nociception. If I hit my shin on something, I'm going to have pain. If I stub my toe, I'm going to have pain. And that's going to create nociception. Sometimes we can have injuries. Think of things like if you've ever had a clean cut and it doesn't really cause a lot of pain until much later. Or even things like a paper cut that are very, very small but hurt very bad. So we can have altered perceptions of nociception as it correlates to pathology and injury. And then, so that means if nociception equals pain and pain equals nociception, that pathology should equal pain, but more often than not, it doesn't. So you've probably known people out there that have maybe went into a doctor or a physician for some issue and realized that they had years earlier blown out their ACL and they've been operating without an ACL, or they have a torn rotator cuff and they didn't even know it and they don't even have shoulder pain. This is very, very common. So why we talk about this is to make sure that we know that we can have damage to tissues that doesn't cause pain, and we can also have damage to tissues that does cause pain. So basically, pain is just an alert. It doesn't tell us that anything is necessarily wrong, all the time at least. So when we're dealing with pain, we want to make it very, very easy. We don't want to say that there's necessarily something wrong, that I have something pathologic, because most runners are not going to deal with run injuries necessarily. They're going to deal with sensitization. So that means that the tissues, the nerves surrounding the area of pain have become overused, and your brain is trying to alert you to the problem of overuse or altered patterns, or maybe a little bit of dysfunctional movement. And there's not necessarily an injury, it's just that there's pain. So the best way to attack this stuff is through just kind of a no-nonsense approach, which would be to calm stuff down, build stuff up. Now, this is explained really well, and in this slide I purposely put the calm stuff down and then the BSU, or the build stuff up, with a big brain in the middle, because what we're probably truly affecting when we do things like foam rolling and stretching and taping and soft tissue and adjusting is we're probably having a far greater impact on the brain, which is then altering the perception of the pain in the body. And I hope that makes sense to everybody. A really good book that can explain this a little bit better is The Sensitive Nervous System. This is written for the layperson. David Butler, very good at explaining how our body works as it relates to pain. So let's say we're dealing with an injury. What would be a good way to approach this injury or the pain that we're having, right? We want to calm stuff down. So things like foam rolling, lacrosse ball, voodoo floss. So it's an input. It's changing the perception of that tissue. I'm sure you've all foam rolled something like your calves or your quads, and it felt very, very tight and sore before, and we foam roll for a minute, which doesn't feel great, right? We endure a little bit of stress. We get up and we feel better. Well, I can guarantee you that 1 minute of foam rolling did not change anything whatsoever in that quadriceps or that calf muscle. And if it did, we're in big trouble, because that means when we go to run and say we go put 10 miles in on the road, the amount of impact and forces we're putting up through our body would mean we would literally disintegrate if we believed that something like foam rolling could alter the state of a muscle. All right, so we're just changing perception when we're putting an input into the body. Massage along the same lines, right? These are all different ways. So stretching, Normatec, so calming stuff down. So Normatec gets into a little bit different side of things, which we may be affecting on all of these, is we're kind of messing with the brain, but we're also probably stimulating the lymphatic system, the venous system. So we're helping basically flush some of these stagnant metabolites out of the system, get the lymph moving, create a better circulation so we get nutrients to the muscles to allow them to heal and recover as well. Ice baths. So again, calm stuff down. We're going to decrease inflammation. If we sit in the ice bath long enough, we're going to have analgesia because we're going to get numb. NSAIDs. So this is one where we should have a little asterisk by it, but obviously ibuprofen, Tylenol, aspirin, these things are, they block a pain receptor, and via NSAIDs we can decrease pain, we can decrease inflammation, but when I have people that take NSAIDs, I always challenge them with this thought process. If I take something like ibuprofen and then I allow myself to go run, I've basically shut down the pathway from the body part up to my brain, but my brain is still knows that there's something wrong there. So now I'm basically making it harder for my body to tell my brain what's going wrong, right? The pain was the alarm, and I'm basically subduing the alarm even though there's something still wrong there. So what we find is you may sensitize the tissue more. Your body's going to make it easier to create pain there, create pain in more areas around the same injury site. So now we've taken 1 alarm to 5 alarms because you're trying to block that pain pathway, and your body is basically saying, we've got to get your brain to realize that you need to stop. It also is going to reinforce maybe altered or compensatory patterns because you're having to figure out how to run around pain that is just not being perceived. So we need NSAIDs at some points, but we also don't want to maybe think about it as something we take to be able to do an activity. Meditation guided imagery. This is a pretty big one. You can definitely decrease pain. You can decrease perception of pain. You can also reorient maybe fear avoidance when we see people that aren't necessarily dealing with an injury anymore, but their brain has associated pain with, let's say it's running or a deadlift or a squat, where anytime they go to perform that, they have pain even though they don't have pain with any other activity. And then appropriate exercise. So getting yourself to move different ways or just altering motor patterns can absolutely have an effect on calming stuff down. Breathing, big one. And we're going to talk about this more in detail here pretty soon. And then symptom modification. So along the same lines as appropriate exercise, just simply if we say that it hurts to move my leg like that, well, don't move your leg like that for a while. And I know that seems very just, too easy to say, but that's sometimes what we need to do. And sometimes it means that we don't need to run or do our sport of choice for a certain amount of time. Maybe more so even so we're not altering those motor patterns. So on the back end of the injury, we don't have to work as hard to get back to square one. And believe it or not, guys, sometimes running is the way home. So if we're dealing with one of those scenarios where let's just say our system, so our body and our brain as one, have started to tie pain to a certain activity even though there's no pathology present, we may need to get creative on how we're going to reintroduce these activities. So sometimes that means chunking running up. So we do, short intervals with walking. We do guided imagery with running to basically trick your brain back into basically thinking that we can do that activity without pain. So then once we've calmed stuff down, we need to build stuff up. So we've decreased that perception of pain. We've altered some movement patterns. Now we actually have to work on what was the issue or may have been the issue. And this is just a broad strokes approach to kind of working back through an injury. So this is not a protocol. This is not a cookbook. This is just a broad strokes explanation. So isometric loading. So isometric is basically static position with tension. So we're not moving the joint or muscle. We're in a fixed position, fixed length, and we apply load. So this is a very safe loading or tensioning pattern for the muscle, tendon, ligament, bone. Also, studies have shown if we create an isometric load over the duration of 30 to 40 seconds, 30 at the least, we're going to get an analgesic effect. So we actually get pain relief through isometric loading. So if we're dealing with an injury, this is very, very safe place to start, and we can usually start this very early, if not right away, in injury treatment. Then eccentric loading. So an eccentric load on a muscle, tendon, or ligament is going to be where we're loading that system under while we're lengthening it. So that would be like a negative or a tempo, if you've heard that before. Also noted, the eccentric load is where most soft tissue injuries are going to occur. So as we eccentric load, we're going to undergo a lot of vibration through the muscle, and that vibration kind of makes the muscle a little vulnerable, and that's where you're going to get most of your strain sprains. So that's something we want to go after, because it's going to help us regain full strength at max capacity, and also create, most of your eccentric loads are important in deceleration. Then ballistic loading. So ballistic loading is basically moving through full ranges, not necessarily full range of motion, but basically we have speed built into the equation now. And then variable position and surfaces. So we've been operating on just level ground. We may put you on an unstable surface. We may start, jumping on and off boxes. And we're not talking about particular injuries. So again, this is just broad strokes. And then this is just a piece of advice, is we want to make sure that we can own the end ranges of our range of motion. Now, what's that mean? Let's say I am a runner, and we know for a runner that on average we need about 120 degrees of hip flexion. So that's driving the thigh and the knee forward as we swing that leg through. Now, let's say I only have actively, if you told me to stand on one leg and raise my other knee as high as I could, I only have 130. So that means every time I take a step or a stride as a runner, I'm almost maxing out my hip range of motion, active motion. So I'm kind of toying, or I'm almost playing in my full range of motion, which means I'm closer to maxing out that joint and the soft tissue and the ligament and tendon, which could set me up for an injury, because our muscles are designed to be strongest in the mid-range. So if you were going to test my bicep and my elbow was at 90 degrees, I'm going to be very strong. I'm going to be weaker with my elbow almost fully extended, and also weaker with it fully flexed. So these just create buffers for injury prevention when we increase our ranges of motion through mobility, and then we strengthen those end ranges through this same patterning, this isometric and then eccentric then ballistic. We really can improve and create barriers or limitations for injury. So a good way to say that would be control yourself. And this is kind of copied from Dr. Andrea Spina's Functional Range Conditioning, which is a very good program to start to learn how to improve ranges of motion under control. So when we deal with an injury, one of the first things we need to do after we've calmed stuff down, build stuff up, is we need to expose that injury mechanism or body part or tissue or ligament or muscle to the same types of demands that we incurred during the injury. And this may seem a bit counterintuitive, but if I deal with a lot of trail runners going to have an inversion ankle sprain, which inversion is this type of movement over here, or this person's in a supinated position, this is pronated. But we want to start loading that person or that injury back into those patterns for two reasons. We want to strengthen those tissues, joints, ligaments, tendons, muscles that may have been damaged or were stressed beyond their limits. We also want to allow your brain to feel comfortable with loading into these positions, so we don't have a fear avoidance. So it's a twofold. We need to be able to train for what we need to be able to do, but we also need to be able to limit the amount of damage that can occur when we have these types of movements. So if I know I'm going to be on an unstable surface running at full speed, maybe downhill, and there's the chance that I'm going to roll my ankle, which would be my goal, right? I want to set a goal of, hey, if I roll my ankle, I want it to be a grade 1 instead of a grade 3. So I want to strengthen all of those soft tissues. I also want to desensitize both my peripheral nervous system and my central nervous system to that injury. So one of the biggest things we can talk about to help with recovery is cross-training. And I know we all have ideas of cross-training, and they're all different. I'm not here in the webinar to tell you what type of cross-training is better, but what we need to, a good rule of thumb for cross-training would be It needs to be different from my activity of choice. And when I say different, I don't just mean different movement. I mean different, basically, energy source or power system. So if I'm a runner and I spend all of my cross training swimming, I'm probably training more in the aerobic zone of my body, right? Versus if I can get in and maybe do 1 or 2 high intensity workouts every week, now I'm training a different energy system, which I'm moving a different way. I'm loading the nervous system a different way, pulling from a different energy system. So overall, I become more efficient. And in things like endurance sports, like running, swimming, cycling, efficiency is king. And then again, varying movement patterns taxes your nervous system in different ways. So things like yoga, stretching, FRC, whatever it is, basically kind of when we talked early in the webinar about pruning. So we really ingrain pathways in our brain when we do the same movements over and over. We almost want to prune those to even out the playing field so our brain doesn't become so inundated with those same movement patterns that it may start to basically want to look elsewhere for things to influence the brain. So that's where we may sensitize the nervous system to a particular activity. So we want to constantly be switching it up and create variety. Just like you wouldn't want to eat the same thing every day because you get a little sick of it, your nervous system may get a little sick of the same movement every day, and it may start to let you know it's sick of it through pain or through injury. So not going to go into the details on cross training, just realize we need varied movement. We need enough of it to offset both the physical and the neurologic demands that we're putting on our body and nervous system. So next, breathing. So this should say Carol Levitt, not Carol Lewis. Carol Levitt was a PT out of the Eastern Bloc, and he was very, very big into breathing as it normalized both pain and dysfunctional movement patterns. And he always said if breathing is not normalized, no other movement can be. There is so much we could talk about breathing. I'm just going to try to highlight a few points. So breathing as a movement, horizontal expansion versus vertical elevation. So vertical elevation would be if you took a deep breath in and your chest moved upwards towards your head, which we could also call secondary respiration or apical breathing, versus horizontal if you think of your torso and your chest expanding like a barrel with each breath. We're usually born into this world as horizontal breathers. We see a change in children around 6 to 8 years old where they are going to alter their breathing patterns for a variety of reasons. And a lot of these are theorized, not completely substantiated with research, but a lot of the thoughts are around restrictive clothing, like tight-fitting pants and belts. Sitting a lot is going to put you into flexion, which actually makes it easier to be a more vertical or apical breather. Vanity. So we get by the pool, we want to suck in our belly, which is going to put us into a secondary respiration pattern. And then what has been researched more in the recent past is that around 6 to 8 years old is when we're really subconsciously cueing off of our parents. And if our parents are an apical or chest breather, we're going to pick up that motor pattern from them. So advice to the parents out there to pay attention to how you're breathing because your kids are watching. Longer exhale than inhale. Now, the reason being is that most people walking around are hyperinflators. So they're actually hanging on to a little more air than they should. When we do this, we're not going to fully be able to fill the lungs because it's like trying to fill a glass that's already full. We're also not going to fill up the deepest part of the lungs or the lowest lobe, which has the highest what's called perfusion ratio. So that's where air comes into contact with blood the most. So we get the most O2, CO2, basically gaseous transfer. And besides a longer exhale and inhale, I'd also say that most people are just over breathers, not as in volume, but as in the amount of breaths they take. And we see altered breathing patterns associated with things like pain and stress, which should make sense. You're going to breathe more if you're in pain. But an interesting thing is there may be a chicken or egg effect there. Is the breathing affecting the pain, or is the pain affecting the breathing? Nasal is preferred. We're programmed to breathe through our noses. A lot of reasons for this. We We warm the air as we bring it through the turbinades of our nose. We also get a little bit of a release of NO2 or nitric oxide, which can kind of help clean the air out. We filter the air through the hairs and the cilia in our nose. So it sets off a cascade that is more palatable from a physiologic standpoint for breathing. Interesting note too, kids that are mouth breathers will have a less developed upper palate. So as we keep our mouth open, we don't have the tongue pressed against the roof of the mouth, so we don't get as much curvature there, which sets us up for depressed facial features. So not as strong of a chin, jaw, or cheekbones. So it may not just be performance related, it may be also a bit of a basically a beauty thing. Shift to mouth nasal hybrid during high intensity. So I always try to get my athletes to, right before they get into the zone where they're really not able to catch their breath, to try to take a big nasal breath and a longer exhale. So we're going to basically displace or exhale off more CO2. CO2 is the trigger that creates basically your air hunger. So as CO2 builds, we want to breathe more. That's what creates a increased breathing rate as you exercise. Also, the reason we want to dump off CO2 though is if we think about what's called the central governor theory, we may think that fatigue is actually being brought on more so by perceived, basically for perceived factors in the brain rather than actual fatigue in the muscle. So it may not be that we're truly running the muscle and the body out of energy. It may be that our brain is picking up on things like just perceived exertion, how hard it thinks you're working, how fast you're breathing, how much CO2 is being held onto. And these things are actually hitting the brain, so we're actually shutting the body down way before we're actually fatigued. And that therefore you see things like a kick at the end of a race where somebody can still sprint all out for 500 yards when they felt like they were completely fatigued. So this is a good just little practice drill. And there's a lot out there on breathing, and we have a lot of videos on our YouTube channel and our website. But 10 belly breaths with a forced exhale. So you could literally just put one hand on your belly button, one hand on your sternum, and try to feel the bottom hand or the belly hand move more than the chest hand would. Hopefully we're through the nose on those. Focus on belly button to spine on exhale. So we want to force that air out. This is sometimes called a 4-7-8. I don't have the 7 in here, or a sniper breathing protocol, but a 4-count inhale, and then sometimes we'll have people hold for 7 and then exhale on an 8 count. And for some people this is very, very hard. Now an ideal amount for these breaths, I'm having you only do 10, would be 60 to 70, right? So also there is a test where we could take a very, very big inhale through our nose, completely exhale, so we completely run out of air. We should be able to hold our breath on a full exhale around about 40 seconds. So there's something called a Bolt scale, which is a little bit different, where we just take normal breaths, we do a full exhale, and then we see how long we can hold our breath, and we'll see that most people can't even make it over 20 seconds, which is a big problem if we're going to be an athlete, because we're basically just putting our body through more stress to perform. We're not saying you can't do the activity, it's just the amount of stress that your body is withstanding while we do the activity. So hydration. So just general guidelines here, and a lot of these things you've probably heard before, but let's go over them. So 12 to 20 ounces first thing in the morning. Now one thing I don't have down here is this is going to be, and this is maybe all of your water, is going to be better off at just a room temperature. And you may say, I really like cold water after hard exercise. You got to realize, think of putting cold water over grease. So it will coagulate that grease. Well, cold water can basically slow down a lot of the digestive processes in our body. That's not necessarily what we want to do, especially first thing in the morning if we're going to eat breakfast after this. So room temperature water, 12 to 20 ounces before we've done anything, before coffee, anything, because we've basically had hopefully 6 to 8 hours of doing not much. We've had our lymphatic system working, our microglial system working. We want to flush out any of the things that our bodies had to filter via the kidneys and help those kidneys get back to normal function. Because on average, our kidneys were designed to basically filter about 2 liters of water a day. So let's kickstart them with something good. Good note to put in here, I tend to put sea salt or lemon or apple cider vinegar, not necessarily all of these, maybe one of these, more often sea salt, just a pinch in my water in the morning for 2 reasons. We do want to flush the system, but we also don't want to set ourselves up to start flushing electrolytes right away. So if we drink 12 to 20 ounces of water and then we're going to have something like coffee and then continue to drink water throughout the day, we don't want to just basically be urinating constantly. The other reason is we don't want to be urinating constantly just because it can become annoying to get up every 20 minutes. So basically creating some sort of an electrolyte bolus that's going to help us hang on to our water is going to keep us from dehydrating ourselves through just constantly peeing out our electrolytes. Good rule of thumb for active individuals, 3/4 body weight in ounces of water each day. So if you weigh 100 pounds, you would get around 70 to 75 ounces of water. Half of that needs to have an electrolyte supplementation. So that doesn't mean you have to buy something like a powdered mix or anything. It could just be simply sea salt and just a pinch per maybe 12 to 20 ounces. But if we take let's say we take that 75 ounces of water and we're just drinking pure water, we're going to start to flush electrolytes, which you need the electrolytes and metabolites to hang on to the hydration or the H2O. Rule of thumb for exercise, for every half hour of exercise, we're going to want around 20 ounces of replacement. And this could be just plain water. It could have supplementation in it. Coffee and tea do not count towards your total. And then what absolutely does not count is alcohol. Alcohol would actually subtract. So if you have a 12-ounce beer, that's subtracted from your 75 ounces of water. It's a good way to keep track of it. And again, these are guidelines. These are not hard, fast rules. Now, nutrition is very watered down because we could talk about nutrition for a whole nother hour. So these are just very, very basic guidelines. Eat whole foods. I hope we know that. One thing that I will talk about is don't overeat. It's not a good thing to do if we're trying to maintain basically ideal weight. Also, it makes it harder for your body to digest. If we overeat, we'll get things like indigestion. So if we put in a hard bout of exercise and our body is going under reparative maintenance, the last thing we want to do is pull blood out of the extremities for long durations to digest large meals. We want to keep our meals pretty moderate, so we're kind of always just churning the engine, keeping the engine fired. And that does not mean that it's this rule of 5 to 6 small meals a day. It just means a moderate meal when not overeating till you're excessively full. Recovery specific. So post-exercise, we do want to get something with a protein and carb source within 20 minutes of exercise. Some people get really hung up on 10 grams of protein and a fast-burning carb, and it needs to be a 4-to-1 ratio of carb to protein. I would say for the general public, we just need some protein and carbs. If you're an elite athlete, that's where we get into more specifics. But like I said, this is just very, very broad strokes. So if we can get our hydration dialed in, we can eat whole foods, we don't overeat, we get some food after our exercise, we're probably going to be doing pretty good. All right, so that's kind of the bulk of what I wanted to talk about as it pertains to recovery and how we can basically, I hope, give you a better roadmap. But what you need to realize and this goes for anything, perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. So what that means is we don't need to go out and buy all these fancy hydration mixes. We don't need to go out and do 4 CrossFit training, cross-training classes a week and run 70 miles a week. We need to actually think in more of a reductionist standpoint when it comes to when we're talking today is athletic performance. So do what you need to do. Make sure your body can do those things without stressing itself out too much from both a movement and physiology standpoint. We don't need a bunch of fancy supplements. We need to eat real food. We don't need a bunch of energy drinks. We just need maybe some water with a little bit of sea salt. But really think simplicity is king. So think of your training and your body as a a piece of granite, and instead of adding more rocks to it, we're carving away until we basically get down to our truest form, which is going to be when we perform best. I really appreciate you guys hanging out with me for this webinar, and if you have any questions, you can always get a hold of me at Dr. Beau Beard on social media, and then drbeaubeard@gmail.com. Thank you.